gets to the end of when you've developed your drug product and you feel like you've done everything you could ever do to find out about the drug product, and you realise that it doesn't even end there and you've got to do more on your drug product. And it's just about being constantly aware of what's happening. So this is really just about post-market surveillance. So once you put your drug out there on the market, you're going to continuously monitor it, and it's really looking for unrecognised adverse events. So people will use drugs in loads more contexts than you ever thought was possible. People will be on drug combinations you didn't think of. So there'll be all sorts of people who are taking a wide variety of drugs in different ways. And those combinations may create adverse events you hadn't anticipated. So you can do all the sort of predictions you want, but there's always someone who's doing something wild and wacky who you haven't considered. So it increases all the knowledge on risks and benefits, and you can provide updated information. So you can sometimes recognise, actually, with this specific drug and this one, it creates a problem, so we don't use it anymore. And it's how you monitor those and make sure that you're taking the appropriate action. You don't just let it all carry on and drift on. You have to actually take action. So that's the basic term of pharmacovigilance. So it's about monitoring medicines and how we record that data. And it's just about having a centralised process that we all know. So if something happens to one patient here in Birmingham, how do we let all the other people involved in similar patients' care know about this risk so that they can stop it happening to other people? And that's all it is, really. It's just making sure we're collecting this in a central place and disseminating that knowledge so that everyone's getting access to safe and efficacious medicines. So this is just some of the measures that are used. An adverse drug reaction is a response to a drug which is unintended. So it's not an overdose. You know, if you take too much of it, then that's an overdose. An adverse drug reaction, it occurs at doses normally used in man. So you're using the drug as prescribed and as directed, and something's happening that shouldn't. If you're using it incorrectly, that's a different thing. So that's the adverse drug reaction. An adverse event can be any untoward medical event that can occur. So this is something that doesn't necessarily have a relationship with the treatment. So adverse events can be things like if someone starts, you can't relate it exactly to the drug, but it seems to be related. So it's all to do with how you create that link. So when I was talking before, I can't remember where it was, when I talked about the different types of side effects and adverse events, it's how closely you can link it to the drug, which one of those is happening going forwards. And the side effect, again, is what we were talking about before. It's an unintended effect that occurs at the relevant dose. So some people will get side effects, and when you read the patient information leaflet and it lists the side effects, it could put you off taking any medicine. And what I guess you've got to remember is those only happen in a very small incidence of people. But if you are one of those unlucky people, it's worth being aware of it and looking out for some of those signs. So how common are adverse drug reactions? Probably more common than you'd think. 6.5% of hospital admissions are related to adverse drug reactions. It's quite a lot. Cost to the NHS is about £500 million, £500 million. Quite significant. 2% of those admitted with an adverse drug reaction died, and that's 5,700 deaths per year in the UK. So it's quite a significant number. And the most horrible statistic there is that 72% were definitely or possibly avoidable. So that's the bit that we've got to think about. And this sounds horrible, but sometimes adverse drug reactions happen, and it's what we can do to prevent them that's more interesting. So this is how we monitor licensed medicines in the UK. So there is a yellow card scheme that I'm going to come on to talk about later on. So we can do clinical and epidemiological studies. So a clinical study is what we've talked about. So when someone's in a clinical study, you will monitor all sorts of things to do with side effects and adverse events. And I've got some examples coming on. You can also follow people through. So epidemiological studies look at patterns of behaviour in big populations. You can look at things in published literature. The drug companies have a role to play. They have a lot of this data, and there's controversy about how well they're sharing it at the moment. And the other people that know a lot are the regulatory authorities, because all adverse events should be notified to the regulatory authorities, and it's what they do with that data. You can imagine there's a huge amount of data, and it's how we do it. And again, sometimes morbidity and mortality. So when you look at when people die, you normally look at what the cause of death is. There's a lot of information recorded when someone dies. You can look for patterns. If suddenly there's a whole spate of deaths and they're all on certain medicines, you might try and put the cause and effect together. So the yellow card scheme is it used to be a physical yellow card. I'm trying to think if there still is an actual physical yellow card. And it used to be in the formularies for nurses and doctors where you could fill in. So if a patient has an adverse reaction, you could fill in a cardboard, send it off to the authorities, and they would be logged. And they would look for patterns in those things. You can now do patient reporting, and I think I've got a slide on that to come later on. The pharmaceutical companies must also report based on anything that comes back to them. So on your information sheet, there's probably free phone numbers you can phone. People can report adverse events to all sorts of places. Some people won't be bothered to go back to the doctor because of the hassle of getting appointments. They might not know who to tell, so they'll phone the hotline. So it's just about who tells who what about their adverse reactions. So for a newly licensed medicine, so you haven't got that much information yet, it's only been on the public sale for a short while, they're monitored more closely because there's more likely to be things happening in those agents. So they're given sort of a black triangle. It's just a symbol to say, you know, we'll take these ones a bit more seriously because we're still learning. Things like paracetamol that have been out there for ages, if you put an adverse drug reaction that's never previously been seen, someone will probably think it's not likely to be that drug. So it's just about how seriously they take things. So all suspected reactions must be reported for new drugs and only serious ones for established drugs. So again, it's about how you classify things as serious. A new doesn't just mean a new drug, it could mean a new route of administration or a new indication or a new product. So if you go from a thrice daily tablet to a once daily tablet, there still could be differences. And this is just a sort of a system, don't worry too much about that, about how we monitor it. This is the old-fashioned yellow card, what you'd have to write on it. So there'd be a reporting doctor and the patient details, suspected drug. So you'd put the batch number as well in case it was just a dodgy batch or something going wrong, and you'd talk about what happened. So it could be all sorts of things happening. A little bit more detail there, just show you the two sides of the piece of paper. This is the sort of newer thing here. So the MHRA is the UK's regulatory agency, and again, now you can actually go for the information for patients, and you can now report your own yellow card. So you can report for someone else or for yourself. I think the button must be missing off here, but you can actually click and fill in those details. It's sort of part of my job today is to advertise this and to make sure you're aware of it. If ever you know yourself or anyone else who takes a medicine, they think they've got a reaction, these monitoring schemes are only as good as the data that's inputted. I think there was a survey done recently at Birmingham Children's Hospital. So again, we expect to see more adverse drug reactions in children because they're generally tested in adults, so you expect to see a few more issues. I think last year they filled out 10 yellow cards, which is not many at all. People are generally very poor at filling them in. So it's just my plea to you, if ever you see anything and you're in a position to, fill one in. So again, you can report side effects, you can report all sorts of things, and it's just to show you where it is. This is just what happens to them. It's a process pathway. So someone reports the adverse reaction, the data's entered, acknowledgements is thank you for your report, it's being dealt with. Someone does a bit of a quality of the report. So again here, this is just to do with how many people report it. Sometimes you do get a lot of people who are very particular about medicines and will report all sorts of things. And sometimes there is an element of a judgment as to whether this person is serious or not. People are very suspicious of medicines, so you have to do that. You normally have to see more than one person with the incidents to be able to make a judgment call. But it does depend how specific it is. If someone phones up or reports something and they've had a really terrible reaction, you might take it more seriously. Whereas if someone says they're feeling dizzy after taking a medicine, you might think, well, we'll wait and see how serious it gets. So every week someone looks to see if there's batches of things coming through. And they can be listed as drug safety updates on websites, and that's how we communicate it back to the people that need to know. This is just an impact here. This is obviously one I pulled off a while ago. You can pull these off at any time. It tells you what the medicine is, what the reaction was, drug interactions, and what's happened. So normally what happens is someone's reported that this particular medicine's got an interaction. They'll update the warnings, contraindications, and disseminate that. So the drug company will be obliged to update all their product information, all the information that goes into product packs, all the information that goes out to healthcare professionals about this new finding. They won't have to withdraw all the existing medicine typically unless it's a very serious event, but then they will also have to make sure that the information is clearly disseminated to anyone prescribing the drug. So it depends what it's interacting with, but messages will go out to all sorts of surgeries, practices, and it does rely on people reading various emails, which I'm sure doesn't happen. But this is the kind of thing that happens here. So drug interactions, that's a relatively straightforward thing to deal with. This one's quite interesting here. There was a potential lack of efficacy. So someone obviously reported they were taking the drug and it wasn't working. So they've obviously been taking something before, thyroxine, they suddenly thought it's not working. So actually, what happened is someone's gone and checked. There probably wasn't enough drug in, so they've actually suspended their marketing authorisation. That means that they can't supply that drug anymore. So that's really quite a big action for the company who make the drug. There'll be other suppliers. So while they can't make it, they're not making any money off it, and the patient's being provided with a product from a different supplier. So you can get various different things again here. So this is the kind of things that happens. There's a couple there to just pick out. This black triangle, I think I'd mentioned this was for new drugs. So it's for medicinal products subject to additional monitoring. So when you're prescribing something, or if you're ever given a medicine, in the information sheet it would have this symbol by it. And it's about being extra vigilant in identifying and reporting adverse drug reactions. Again, it's just to make sure that we're capturing as much information as possible to make sure everyone's safe going forwards. It used to be just in the UK, and I think now it's gone Europe-wide, well, 3 years ago. It's just a way, again, of making the most of all the data that we've got. This is the other thing. Astute healthcare professionals submit case reports. If you see something unusual, and if you're an academic healthcare professional, you might write a little case study on it. It helps your career by getting publications, and it builds your reputation. That's something that people are generally doing in their free time. Your jobbing GP has not got time to do this, so it relies on people's goodwill and motivation. This is why pharmacovigilance is so important. Often people notice these things and go, oh well, and carry on with their day-to-day life, so many of these are missed all the time. It can give people a basis for a further study, and it can get people talking about a subject. Sometimes these can lead to a cohort study where you actually think, well, I've seen this in one patient, let's have a look. So you can look through the electronic medical records of every patient on that drug and see how many of the rest of these have experienced, whether it be a rash, headaches, or any other more serious side effect. So you can actually do that kind of thing. So you can do a cohort study. So you compare that group. You normally compare them to a similar demographic. So if it's happening particularly in 50-year-old women, you look at 50-year-old women not on that medicine to make sure it's related to that medicine, not just a general lifestyle event. Again, you can do case control studies, so you can look at the drug usage in a population that have experienced an adverse drug reaction to those who haven't. Is it something that's specific to that group of people, or is it not? So, and you need to provide information about whether the drug was responsible for the adverse drug reaction. So when I was growing up, aspirin was commonly used in children, and Junior Disprin was one of the most popular pain relief brands. Then Ray's syndrome, which was an illness that affected, I think it's 1 in 10,000 children, was linked to aspirin. It's quite a serious illness, so aspirin's no longer certified for use in children. So I grew up, I would have had aspirin, not that often, because thankfully I was never too sick, but I would have had aspirin quite a lot as a child. It didn't affect me. But even though it's only 1 in 10,000, the risk-benefit was suddenly taken away. So now it's not licensed for use in under 16s. Your generation may have been given codeine as a child. Codeine's now been withdrawn for children. And where we have to sometimes be careful is people who are growing up might not realise these drugs have changed. So Disprin was, the word Calpol to you, Disprin to us was the junior medicine. So a lot of people my age would maybe go to a pharmacist or give their child aspirin, not realising the effect because they had it as a child. And it's one of those things that's very important for the public and public health messages to get those out to people. That's my other thing. This was just some evidence. I was trying to collect some data on what's happened about when drugs are withdrawn. And it's actually to show that how you can... So a yellow card might not lead to a drug being withdrawn. That means it's no longer available to sell. But what can lead to a drug being withdrawn can be case reports. So if medical professionals write a case report or do cohort studies or randomised controlled trials, these drugs have actually been withdrawn from the market. So although the drug company did all those tests to prove it was good enough, it can then be withdrawn. But the reason I wanted to talk about this is sometimes people get quite frustrated. To get a drug to market, you have to do loads of clinical trials, submit all this heavy paperwork, and do randomised controlled trials. But to get it withdrawn, you can use that hierarchy of evidence of just one case report. And that's some of the frustrations that people feel. So going back to the Ben Goldacre book, and to my opinion, sometimes it feels a little bit unfair. And it's all to do with the risk-benefit ratio. So it's just to put that there. I just wanted to talk, I've talked very much about the UK with yellow cards. There's similar reporting systems the world over. I'm going to talk about America. So again, they're reported to the FDA, so their regulatory agency, by healthcare professionals, consumers, and the pharmaceutical industry. So it's a pretty similar process. And again, the potential outcomes are the same. Informing healthcare professionals of new risks, reducing the recommended dose of a medicine or making some adaptation to prescribing, or you can withdraw the medicine from the market. I'm going to talk about the withdrawals because they're probably the most interesting here. Vioxx was withdrawn, so it was introduced in 1999, marketed by Merck. So it was on the market for 5 years, and there was, it was withdrawn due to the apparent increase in cardiovascular effects of heart attack and stroke. So a lot of people, and remember in the US it's a much more litigious society than in the UK, and there's various books about drug trials. I can't think of it. John Grisham's written one about, I can't remember what it's called now, but you can read various books about where drugs have gone wrong and how you can sue people. So there was 18 randomised controlled trials and 11 observational studies. So here they looked at 20,000 patients where there were 52 heart attacks in the drug group and 12 in the control group. So you can see for that, you know, there's a big population and a relatively few number of heart attacks, but you're sort of 4 to 5 times more likely to have a heart attack in this group. So again, be wary of reading headlines where it says 4 times more likely to have a heart attack. It might be true, but it's still a very, very low chance. So some of these things happen here. This is just telling you the backstory. So the original, the data set on which the drug was launched was based on 5,000 people, which didn't show an increased risk of stroke or heart attack. Sometimes, you know, a statistician will tell you to be able to show that level of difference, you probably needed to test on that 20,000 population. You're not always going to find these things in your phase 3 studies because you might not have enough of a patient group. 5,000 is still quite a few. There was another study that Merck did, the drug company, when they were looking at actually using it for a gastrointestinal function, and it showed that there was a greater number of heart attacks. And that's added to the data pool in 2002. And at that point, it triggered them to do longer studies. So they're not going to withdraw it until they've got the evidence. They're going to leave it on the market knowing, well, there's a slight risk, but until we've got evidence, we're not going to say to withdraw it. And that's where all the controversy comes in, because some people feel they should withdraw it at that point, and they still feel, well, actually, the risk-benefit ratio is good. Obviously, for the majority of patients, it's brilliant. But if you're one of those that has the heart attack, then it's not good. This is the next part. Again, there's other studies. This is just telling you again that actually this study did. This was another phase 4 study, adding an indication to the label claim, and it did conclude that people had an increased risk of cardiovascular events, heart attack and stroke. And it's really, this is the study that led to withdrawal. So when people talk about whether what drug companies are doing, this is something, it's actually quite a responsible story by Merck, where they were seeing signs, so they were looking more actively for this until they had enough data. I'm sure they were willing it not to happen, but that shows the studies. This is a second example of another drug that was withdrawn, and this is cisapride, used to treat gastrointestinal problems, and again it had cardiac side effects. So again, 386 reports of serious ventricular arrhythmias and 125, including 125 fatalities, and 50 cases of sudden unexplained death. So that's quite a lot of very serious effects. And in the UK, there were 60 yellow card reports relating to serious cardiovascular reactions, and 5 were fatal. So again, this is quite a lot of global deaths, and it shows the reporting procedures here. This is a bit of a case where, don't you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. So the drug was used, these fatalities, it was used in patients with known risk factors. So sometimes when you give a drug, you've got various exclusions. People don't always read that, prescribers I'm talking about here. So you might be prescribed a drug even though you're at risk because they still feel that the benefits outweigh the risks. So these cases, there's various enzymes and pathways that are known to be risks for these types of things. So these patients who were at risk were still given the drug, and it's a high proportion of those that died were in this at-risk group. So there's a big furore around this when it was withdrawn, because actually they asked for the drug to be withdrawn, whereas the drug company would have rather limited their label to say, no, only these people can get the drug, because then it would have had the benefits. They would have shrunk their market size, but they would have been able to keep on supplying the drug. So this is one of those things where there's always a big furore about whether you withdraw the drug, do a blanket withdrawal, or limit your population pool. Just to sort of flag that as an issue. And again, there's something here about a Lipabay, a cholesterol-lowering drug by Bayer, and again, it was withdrawn because it was responsible for 31 deaths in the US and further 21 worldwide. So again, huge numbers of cases of people going to hospital. This is the other thing about the drug-drug interaction was implicated in most of the fatalities in the US. So actually, this one, contrary to the other one, got away with saying that you couldn't use these two drugs together. So rather than it being withdrawn, it's been switched so the label claim was there. And these types of things take a long time. And again, when I'm talking about earlier your statistician being the most valuable person in your company, at this point it's probably your lawyers as to how well they argue the case that whether your drug is withdrawn or whether you just limit your population. This is just some other examples from adverse drug reaction and pharmacovigilance. And this is just showing you that how things change and how people are expected to keep up to date. So this was 1998. There was evidence that the estrogens in hormone replacement therapy reduced the incidence of stroke and myocardial infarction. Yet 6 years later, HRT is said to increase the risk of venous thromboembolism and stroke. So again, it's just showing you that things can change and the patient's message needs to change and how doctors prescribe. Seroxat is a huge case. It's an antidepressant. If you want to read lots of angry patient forums, you can go online and read about this. It's really, really controversial. A lot of drugs used in treating depression are super controversial because it's very, very hard to monitor meaningful clinical endpoints. Depression is a really serious illness, and it's very hard to tell the severity of someone's illness because it's all to do with perceptions and feelings. Like what we like as scientists is a nice blood level that will measure it. So depending on how depressed you feel, it'd be great if there was a marker in your blood we could say, oh yeah, very depressed or not so depressed, so we could measure how well the drug's working. You can't do that with these agents, so it's very, very difficult. So it's all to do with safety concerns about numbers of suicide. I mean, depression can lead to suicidal thoughts, and it's really just looking at placebo. So how many people are feeling suicidal on placebo versus this? It's very depressing talk. But you can talk about the age range, and there's a lot of work done here about the use of antidepressants in those under 18. For a long time, there was no licensed products to use in under 18s who had depression, yet it's quite a common illness in teenage populations, so it's about how you're going to treat it. So we'll talk about some of the studies. This is just showing the complexity of data. So there's all these different ones, again, about paroxetine and other benefit-risk ratios, about when things get better, worse, and don't change. It's so hard to interpret data about how much people improved and to do with the dose. This is a dose study, going from 20 to 40 to 60. The outcome classification, this is one of those questionnaires. When you go to the doctor, how do you feel? Minimally improved, much improved, very much improved. It's very arbitrary, the measure. And you can see here, generally people are reporting they are minimally to better improved on the higher doses. But it's very, very hard to see. So again, it's just about these scales and endpoint measures, how we measure it. This is just something about adverse effects and how you measure all these different things. Again, the placebo versus the dose, how many adverse effects you see, and what types of things you're going to see. I quite like that anxiety was 0 in the placebo group and it was higher in the drug group. But there's all these different events. And that's just kind of the types of thing that you start to look at. I was just going to talk about withdrawals, not just due to adverse drug reactions, but to do with products. There's a vaccine developed by Merck, MSD, rather. And again, there's lots of patients developing illnesses, and they looked at it, and it wasn't necessarily the drug itself creating the problem, it was the drug product. So it was the media components from the bovine tissue extracts. So again, it wasn't the drug itself, it was the way it was manufactured, the process and the controls around that caused the issue. That was quite an old one from the 1980s. This is a much more recent one, so this is 2012. So, you know, only a few years ago. It was contaminated injections used for meningitis. So contaminated steroids were being used that resulted in meningitis. So meningitis, I'm hoping most of you know in this room, is a very serious illness that can affect young people. When they went to investigate this, they actually found that there was some injectable products should be sterile. You're going to inject it into your body. You want it to be nice and clean. This had some sort of greenish black mould in it, and it was that was leading to the meningitis. 14,000 patients could have received that. This is young people. So doses have been administered to these people. I think it was 48 people had died and 720 being treated to persistent fungal infections. So this is quite a serious type control. So this is the kind of thing where they would actually try and obviously pull it off the shelves in the pharmacy. There was cases before where they've gone to people's homes, tried to identify who's bought it, make sure they throw it away. It's a bit like a recall, but recalling who's had a particular medicine has been very difficult. So again, this is a pretty horrific story about it, but it's just saying that it does happen up until quite recently. This again is just a little bit more of withdrawals. It's just telling you a few. In case you're really interested in this, sometimes it's quite nice just to have a look at the risks. The thing that I quite like to see on here, cardiovascular risks seem to be really, really huge. And it's obviously showing me, from the scientist in me, that we're not really assessing cardiovascular risk very well as we go through. So if anyone wants to make loads of money, try and find an assay that measures cardiovascular risk of medicines. I think you'd be well away. This is just one of the last ones about largest fraud settlements in history. This is again the US. GSK, basically they'd admitted to promoting antidepressants for unapproved uses. So I'm talking about getting drugs approved. You normally get the drug approved to treat an illness. So these drugs are approved to treat illnesses in adults. So yeah, okay, all the evidence that you've done, all your data collection has been done on adults, and we say, yes, it works in adults. There's a very likely chance that these drugs are going to work in young people, especially those aged 12 to 18, because physiologically and anatomically, you're almost at adult proportions. But you're not allowed to say that it will work until you've got the evidence. And this is a classic example of salespeople promoting it and saying, yeah, it will work in adolescents without there being any evidence. And then again, there's all these side effects. Although you might be anatomically adult size when you're that age, you've got to go through the hormone phase of puberty, which particularly for some of the antidepressants can add to the sort of milieu of all the hormones and things going on. So this is just finding that they negligently failed, can't say the word, to warn a doctor about treating. This is again about treating pregnant people. So again, during pregnancy, when you've got hormone imbalances, people can feel quite depressed. There might not be a drug licensed for use in pregnancy because no one does clinical trials in pregnancy. So you've got to make a decision about whether you want to take that drug or carry on, and you've got to look at the patient's best interest. They'd found about 800 packs of birth defects, cost at $1.14 billion. Each family, family's getting $2.5 million. This is basically how much they pay, and there's $390 million for suicides. So there's huge money being paid out here by GSK. I guess this is the thing about $3 billion fines, but what you've got to really look about, the period covered by the settlement, they sold $10.4 billion, $5.9 billion of this one, and $11.6 billion of that, so it's less than 15%. And this is where all the corruption comes in and why people get quite angry about drug companies. So that was just to sort of highlight the sort of numbers we're involved in. And this was just one more, I think I've got, of Andia, because it was a more recent example. There was safety data accumulated since the launch. So that's what I wanted to say here. So this sentence here is the most important. The EMA have looked at safety data accumulated since the launch and have decided that the benefits no longer outweigh its risks. It's got increased risk of heart problems, and it's got no particular groups. So if you could have said, oh, it's really only going to affect this group, you could eliminate them from prescribing and carry on. But if it's no group, you've got to take it away from everybody. So again, this is some of the debate here. So the EMA wanted to withdraw it. The manufacturer came back with 42 randomised clinical studies, and they've got this 30 to 40. So this is it was really to do with the diabetes. So that was just to sort of tell you the other story there. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the corporate responsibility for pharmacovigilance. Now, it used to be pharmacovigilance, and one of the reasons why it was so hard to sue drug companies is because it used to get passed around to one person to another. And it was always, oh yeah, but you need to talk to this person, and there's not one person. So now there has to be one person. It was established in 2004, where there's one person within a company who is responsible, is personally responsible for the safety of human pharmaceutical products. And that's quite a huge responsibility. Qualified person responsible for pharmacovigilance. That person is responsible for establishing and maintaining the pharmacovigilance, preparing the reports and answering requests. So this is a new role. You wouldn't be personally liable, so they're not going to sue you as a person because one person's never going to be richer than a drug company. But it's that one person's responsibility. So again, it was just to sort of highlight that there's now a role there for people who are desperately interested, and I imagine it's a very highly paid role. So that was just for me to say that that's the drug development process, to say that it doesn't really ever end. That's a nice short one to finish on. If anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to hang around for a while because I know I've given you loads of information throughout the course of today. So if you've got anything, I'm happy to stay for a while. Otherwise, you've got my email on some of the slides.